the second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental laws in science, tells us that allow things to just happen and they will get simpler. And yet we look at the history of the universe, and in the Big Bang, the universe begins very, very simple. It's incredibly simple. It's just a kind of massive energy. And then slowly, over 13.8 billion years, as the universe expands and gets cooler, you see the appearance of more complex things. So actually, the history of our universe is a history of the appearance of increasingly complex things. In the next 100 years, we won't be going to other star systems. That could happen in a few thousand years, but not in the next 100 years. But I think there will be colonies on different parts of the solar system.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
David, thank you so much for being on the Ignition Sequence podcast. Really appreciate you coming on all the way from Sydney, Australia.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
And I know we have like a 19-hour time difference. I'm in Southern California, west coast of the United States. You're in Sydney. And how's the weather down in Sydney?
The weather's actually a bit rainy at the moment. I've been reading about, whiplash climatic conditions, because we have a friend in LA whose house was lost, and it's been very hot, and now suddenly it's a bit quite rainy here. So,
well, I'll be honest with you, this is not my typical origin of doing these podcasts. I'm in a RV with friends in Palm Springs, California, because I personally live in Pasadena, California, near Eaton Canyon, where the fires exploded, or one of the big fires exploded. The devastation was obviously, apocalyptic, and over 5,000 structures burned to the ground, and winds sustained above, 80 miles per hour. I mean, it was just crazy. But now it's the air pollution. The air quality index is above 250, 300. And so I had to relocate and do the show from here in Palm Springs, where I could breathe and not have my eyes burning and my lungs burning. But I am very curious to get to, all these changes with extreme weather, these extreme fire events and things like that, getting into these threshold moments that are part of your big history, thesis. I'd like to kind of get into that a little bit later on. But first of all, tell us about big history and how you came to this idea that big history is important for us to study and understand to move forward with humanity.
Thanks for the question. I'm a Russian historian originally, and during the Cold War, I spent a year in Leningrad, and Russian history during the Cold War seemed immensely significant because for most of my students, Russia, the Soviet Union, was the other half. It was the dark side. The world, there was two worlds. And I felt it was very, very important to try to explain something about that world and to explain that real people lived there, coped with that world, people like you and me. They're not all, didn't all have tails and horns. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly Russia became sort of one more country. It lost the kind of global significance it had. And I think I was in mid-career and increasingly drawn by the idea that if we're teaching history, it must be because we want to learn something about the present. So if the past can indeed teach you something about the present, I began to feel perhaps we need to go further back in the past. And I also became increasingly drawn to the idea of a history of humanity, that suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where, as a species, we're transforming this planet in a way that no other species has done in 4 billion years. Something really weird is going on. So how can I make sense of human history as the history not of a nation, not of an empire, not of a religion, but of a species? And that involves thinking biologically. So I thought, oh my gosh, if I'm going to teach a course that does this, I'm going to have to start talking about biology, about evolution. And then I thought, but if I'm serious about evolution, I have to start talking about how life began. And that means talking about the origins of this planet. How did this particular planet emerge that proved to be so life-friendly? And you can see where this is going. It's back and back and back. How did the planet appear? How did the star appear? And eventually, of course, with today's knowledge, you come to a starting point, and that is the Big Bang. I mean, of course, cosmologists now talk about something beyond the Big Bang, which is a multiverse. But at the time when I began, the Big Bang was a good starting point. So I began to ask myself if it was possible to teach a history course that was the whole of the past. And one of the reasons for doing that is because to understand anything, you need to understand the larger thing of which it is a part. And so I thought that most human societies have taught origin stories, and origin stories place today's world in the context of everything, of the whole damn thing. What is the biggest story we can tell that helps make sense of the world we live in at the moment? And those are the sort of questions that led me to the idea of big history. And at first, I must admit, I thought, this is a crazy idea. It could be lots of fun, but it also could be a disaster. And the first 2 or 3 years I taught it, I got lecturers. They're wonderful. They were absolutely wonderful, from astronomers to biologists to geologists to ancient historians to modern historians. And each of them told their own story, and the stories didn't really connect. But over several years, gradually the connections began to emerge. And I realized, and this is in the early 90s, I realized that there really is a whole coherent story there that can help you place today's world in the context of everything, of the universe. There is a modern origin story. And that's the
I
story
did.
that
I just want to say, what I want to get to is I watched your TED talk. I think it's the one that Bill Gates introduced you at, where you use the scrambled eggs analogy, and
that's
I just thoroughly love that because I'm a simple person. I'm not a PhD credentialed scientist by any means. I'm very science curious. I'm very curious about all the topics that I discuss and host on the show. But the scrambled egg analogy was so profound because you really were able to, talk about how an egg is just this complex thing that, but when you crack it and you beat it and you scramble it, it becomes mush and becomes chaos. And then you talk about now what we need to try and do is put the scrambled egg back into the eggshell. And that's complexity. And those things actually happen in our universe, but it takes a lot to get there. And it's really kind of mind blowing when you see the video of a scrambled egg going back into the egg because you played it backwards.
Yeah, well, that was I mean, I had a lot of help producing that little video, and it's a very nice visual image of a way of explaining the idea of entropy, which scares many people who don't have a scientific training. One of the
And
lovely
entropy,
things,
basically, if you don't know what entropy means, it means chaos. It means just, randomness, uncertainty, just you don't know what the hell's going to happen.
well, the idea of entropy also includes the idea that scientists take very seriously, that if you just let things happen, then the general tendency of the universe is towards chaos, towards less organization, towards less complexity. And as we were teaching the big history course, as I said at first, I couldn't see a coherent story. But slowly, a series of coherent questions emerged that crossed all these disciplines, from cosmology to, contemporary international relations. And that was the story about increasing complexity. Because the second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental laws in science, tells us that allow things to just happen and they will get simpler. And yet we look at the history of the universe, and in the Big Bang, the universe begins very, very simple. It's incredibly simple. It's just a kind of massive energy. And then slowly, over 13.8 billion years, as the universe expands and gets cooler, you see the appearance of more complex things. So actually, the history of our universe is a history of the appearance of increasingly complex things. Now, how does that fit? So that's the great paradox. And in a sense, that story of increasing complexity, and of course, it's a story about us, because we are fantastically complex things as individuals. But then take modern humans, we're observing something fantastically complex. How would you get from the simplicity of the Big Bang to extreme complexity? And that became a kind of storyline for big history that crossed all the different disciplines. You can ask the same question about biology. How do you get from bacteria to elephants?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a fantastic question. And in teaching big history, one of the things I was trying to do over and over again, and you alluded to it just now, was to persuade history students, because most of my students were history students, that you don't need to be a quantum physicist to understand some of the fundamental ideas in science. Some of those ideas are really important. They can be grasped at a fairly elementary level. You'll miss some of the nuances, that doesn't matter. And if you do try to understand some of the science, including the idea of entropy, you'll find there's a fantastic modern origin story there. And it's one that can help you make sense of the world we live in today.
How challenging was it for you to really establish some strong foundations in this big history idea? Not having personally, I know you said you brought in some guest speakers and scholars, but not having a rooted academic study of biological science, physics, chemistry, cosmology, astrobiology, any of these type of disciplines. How were you able to kind of meld that all together, being a PhD history professor, and come up with this grand idea?
Yeah, look, it was not easy. When I first committed to the idea, I think some of my friends, some of my colleagues thought I was going through a midlife crisis, which maybe I was. And some of them thought, David, this is going to be a catastrophe. And the reason is because we live in a world where we have a kind of what I think is a rather rigid and narrow idea of what knowledge and expertise mean. And we live in a world in which we assume that experts know a lot about one area, and it's absolutely impossible to see the whole thing. So that there's a lot of resistance to what I was doing. And what I was doing presumed that as a teacher, one of the metaphors I use is, can you take students to the top of the mountain so that they see not just the local landscape, which may be American history or Australian history, or it may be, I don't know, the biology of mammals, something like that. Can you take them to the top of the mountain where they can see from a distance something about cosmology and something about geology and something about biology, and they can learn enough to really help them make more sense of the world? The way knowledge is organized in today's world makes that very difficult. So I've had people say to me, because eventually after several years, I started lecturing on Big Bang cosmology. They said, why are you? You're a Russian historian. You've got a PhD in Russian history. why the hell are you lecturing on Big Bang cosmology? And the answer is because what I'm really lecturing on is this story that fits everything together. And that, I think, I know quite well. I don't know all the details of Big Bang cosmology. I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not a quantum physicist. So there's this domain of knowledge, and it's like an ancient origin story. The Christian Bible contains such a story, which assumed that there is a story that everyone can understand, that holds everything together. You'll miss a lot of the nuances, but there was a lot of resistance to it. But the story became clearer and clearer in my mind, more and more fascinating, more and more intriguing, and more important, because if the past can teach you about the present, and I used to say this to my colleagues, then surely at some point in our education, we ought to try to look at the whole of the past, not just what I learned, which was, a sequence of 19th century English prime ministers, which is what I learned about in school, or in the States, you learn a sequence of presidents, So there ought to be space on the syllabus for an attempt. It won't be completely successful, but for an attempt to see the whole of the past. And I now believe it's very possible.
You talk a lot about, the thresholds into higher levels of complexity. Can you give us some examples? And I think a great one is because everybody can relate to this. My God, there used to be dinosaurs here, and bang, in a split second, they're gone. Because of an asteroid impact here on the Earth. It's like 65 some million years ago. Is that one of those threshold moments you're talking about? Because you wiped out dinosaurs, but then some other things started to happen.
The idea of thresholds was, how can I put it? It's really a teaching idea. It's not a scientific idea. It's in telling this story, I had to kind of clarify certain things. Now, if the central theme is increasing complexity, then I made the decision as a teacher that it would help my students if I picked out several crucial moments when we could see increasing complexity. The Big Bang itself, the creation of the first stars, the creation of new chemical elements, the creation of planets, because planets are actually more complex chemically than stars, and eventually, of course, the creation of life and of humans. Now, these are not scientific categories; they are really teaching categories, but it's a way of trying to speak clearly about the idea of increasing complexity. So I wouldn't say the wiping out of the dinosaurs was itself one of the more important thresholds. What it illustrates is that complex things are also fragile and they can break down very quickly. What is, I think, critical, a threshold is what's happening right now in our world, because for the first time in 4 billion years, an entire planet, the fate of an entire planet, has come into the hands of a species, and it's a conscious species. So planet Earth is turning into a planet that's managed by conscious thinking. Now that is something new. This is a planet that is conscious. It's conscious in the way that our bodies are conscious. Most of what happens in our bodies is not the result of conscious thinking. It's the result of vast numbers of sort of biochemical, neurological processes. But some of the critical decisions about our bodies, should I really try bungee jumping? Some of the critical decisions, should I skip this red light? Should I jump this red light? Some of the critical decisions are the result of conscious thought. And now we have a whole planet whose fate will depend on the conscious thinking of billions of humans. That is something new, and it's something more complex. We don't know if planets like this exist elsewhere in the universe. It could be that this is the only one. But the emergence of stars is such a moment. The emergence of life itself, because life is very different from non-life. That is
Which
a
all
moment.
those things emerged without human conscious thought. They just happened because of the systematic chaos, that kind of complexity found itself. And it kind of, a perfect storm of things happened with atoms and energy and heat, and it created these new thresholds on their own by themselves. And now you're talking about a conscious new layer with humanity thinking. I know we had a guest on our podcast a while ago who talked about, global warming started the minute a caveman invented fire, you know? And all that kind of stuff. So it's really interesting. Now, how long have humans been on the planet?
Yeah, that's we don't have a perfect answer to that question because it all depends on, how you define humans. I think most people would say our species, that is to say, creatures whose minds and bodies were essentially the same as yours and mine, have been around for about certainly 100,000 years, maybe 200 or even 300,000 years. Um, Creatures pretty like us have been around for longer than that, but us about 200 or 300,000 years. And you're right that complexity. So that this question, how did complexity increase despite the second law of thermodynamics, despite the fact that we know the scrambled egg will never rearrange itself and go back into an egg? How did complexity increase? And in each case, we don't have perfect answers. In each case, what we're looking at is a universe in which things that already exist are being rearranged, and some of those rearrangements kind of get locked in place for reasons we don't fully understand. And then you have something new, something that has qualities that didn't exist previously in the universe. So stars, for example, emit heat and light. Before the existence of the first stars, there were no large objects that did that. So this is something brand new. You suddenly have these little fires dotted throughout the universe.
It's fantastic. And you're talking about interconnectedness as well. So my question to you about interconnectedness from the Big Bang to Earth's formation at 4.6 billion years ago to humanity's starting to, conscious thinking, managing their world of humanism 200,000 years ago. This interconnectedness, how does understanding that through your big history idea, how can that help us face our global challenges today?
Well, I think the first thing is that it's a point I made earlier. If understanding the recent past helps us make sense of the present, then understanding the distant past helps us make sense of the present. So, for example, take climate change. Geologists and students of the evolution of our planet now can construct a very good history of climate change over 4 billion years. And we know a lot about the impact of subtle changes in the mix of gases in the atmosphere. So that is knowledge from the distant past that helps us make real sense of what is likely to happen if we humans start messing with the mix of chemicals that is in our atmosphere. So this we know that all the different parts of the universe are interconnected. We don't understand all the interconnections, but we understand many of them. And the big history story can help us see interconnections that you just can't see if you think of history as just a history of, 19th century English prime ministers, or of wars and so on. So, and the other thing about complexity, that complex things are fragile. We see that over and over again. Complex things, unlike simple things, eventually break down. Stars eventually break down. The very simplest things don't seem to break down, but the very complex, the more complex things do. So we know that this fantastically complex world we live in today, there's a certain fragility to it. And we need to be thinking very hard about the nature of that fragility and what we can do as a collective body of 8 billion humans to avoid a collapse, which will be a catastrophe for our descendants.
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because we do have our own consciousness. We do have geopolitical differences. We do have cultural differences. We do have, science itself is an argument. As you stated at the top of this podcast, you were met with a lot of headwinds in trying to present your idea. And, science has a history of, kind of, for lack of a better word, crucifying people who go against the paradigm, and come up with new ideas. Look at what happened to Galileo and some of these other, Oppenheimer and everybody else. So, that's the big problem we have to face, is how can we get everybody on board to this big idea? And is that why you are pushing this theory out there as a big history? Because history, talking about big history, is a lot less intimidating than just the term, climate change. People get really pissed off and want to fight you, and there's all kinds of arguments pro and con about climate change, but big history seems like it's even more inviting. It seems like it's very interesting. What a curious idea. Was that a conscious decision that you made to call it big history, to be more accessible, and to hopefully get more people on board?
The phrase big history sort of popped into my brain not long after I started teaching this, and I thought it was kind of cute and kind of snappy. It meant I didn't have to explain it every time. I sometimes regret the phrase big history because it sounds kind of overblown, but anyway, it's stuck. So we have to live with it. At the moment, news media focus overwhelmingly on conflicts and on divisions. And the way we teach in schools and universities also encourages that. If, for example, to take history, the discipline I know best, if we continue to think of history as a series of national histories, as we do here in Australia, as every state funds courses on national history, what that does is create a sense of different nations in conflict with each other, of 250 million Americans in conflict with 1 billion Chinese and 1 billion Indians. Now, the idea of big history partly represents my feeling that beneath the surface, there is emerging a kind of global consciousness. Now, you think of science. 200 years ago, knowledge of the universe taught in Mongolia, as opposed to the knowledge that was taught in a school in Ecuador, would have been utterly different. The Mongolian school would have taught based on ancient Buddhist scriptures. I'm not sure what would have been taught in an Ecuadorian school, but probably something based on the Christian Bible. Today, the syllabi in those schools will be remarkably similar. So despite the many conflicts within science, there's a hell of a lot of science that we take for granted. And we take it for granted for the very good reason that it shapes our world. It shapes our smartphones. It shapes our cars. It shapes the internet. So science, many aspects of science can be regarded not as national or local, but as global. They are now, many aspects of science are a kind of heritage of all human beings living on the world today. I increasingly believe that that is true of more and more forms of knowledge, that there is emerging, in other words, a sort of global origin story, and big history is part of that. And if I'm right, and I agree, many of the news media don't encourage belief in this story, but if I'm right, then a sense of all humans facing the same challenges, a sense that will encourage global collaboration in dealing with those challenges, is actually emerging beneath the surface of conflicts and wars in today's world.
Looking at where we are today through the lens of big history, how do you think this moment in time will be remembered by future generations?
Well, that's a great big history question. I mean, one of the things I love about big history is that's the sort of question it invites, and it's a question that, high school students love asking, and it's a question we should be asking. So in teaching big history, I realized very soon you have to think about the future. You have to ask the question bluntly, is there something that the past is teaching us about likely futures? So having said all of that, I'll now hedge my bets, because one of the things we do know about the future is that we cannot predict. The future is genuinely open. But what we can do is we can look at past trends and ideally look at very long past trends, the sort of trends that big history looks at, because those are the trends that might give us some guidance about the future. So, for example, to give one example of a long trend that's very powerful, our species, as I've said before, is now doing things that no species has ever done before in 4 billion years of life on Earth. So the question, what is it about us, is an absolutely critical one, and I think it ought to be central to all history courses, frankly. One thing we can say straight away is that our species has always shown a fantastic, let's call it technological creativity. That's not the ideal phrase, but what it means is that we're very good at we share knowledge. We share ideas about the world. So those ideas accumulate across generations. And for any animal, the more information you have about your surroundings, the more control you have over those surroundings. So what's happened in the case of humans is that the information available has been shared and accumulated and added to generation by generation and tested generation by generation. And the more knowledge there is, the more powerful we become. And that's what set us off on the trajectory leading to the present day. So that is a trajectory that's gone on for 200,000 years. So technological creativity is something that I think we can predict will continue unless there's a total breakdown of some kind. Now, is that a
Yeah.
good thing or a bad thing? Because technological creativity includes the internet, it also includes the atom bomb. So this is all very ambiguous. Are we like the sorcerer's apprentice? Are we a species that will get so clever that it will destroy itself? That's a real possibility. Or will this creativity, which is a collective creativity, can we steer that creativity in the direction of collaborating on avoiding catastrophe? That, for me, is the great question. Now,
I think, and talking about that, it's very interesting. I'll just take, for example, the Industrial Revolution, when they learned how to power and harness steam through the heating of coal. The industrialized age just exploded. But the consequence of that was polluted air because of so much coal burning. And, today, to a point and to a degree where even London, people couldn't walk outside for days during certain periods of the year because of air inversions, where they were forced to stay inside for weeks and maybe a month or two at a time because of just the sheer pollutants in the air. The positive thing that came out of it, somebody finally said, we've got to change this. The humanity came together, the collective reasoning, the learning, saying, okay, we've had 50 years of coal burning for steam power, for industrial revolution, for commerce, for success, for money, but we're dying because we're getting cancer now. We have to change how we do this. Are we at an inflection point now? Because you're talking about, we've had in the last 25 years the computer age, so you have the technology revolution, and now we're having the AI revolution. We are on the cusp of the AI revolution, where knowledge is actually getting out of maybe out of our control, and it's creating its own force. Do you have any thoughts where that's going, and are there future helpful solutions to the problems that we're currently facing now head on?
if there are solutions, they may already be present, but we won't know their solutions until the future. So, the openness of the future is real. But if you look at the long trends, there's another long trend that I don't think gets talked about enough. Those are very good trends. What fossil fuels enabled, the steam engine, what that allowed us, it allowed humans to tap into vast new sources of energy. And that availability of energy triggered fantastic innovation as people tried to figure out different ways of using this energy. And that's what we think of as the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the consequences of all of that was that actually, we don't talk about this enough, but billions of people today live better than people have ever lived before in
Yes.
human history.
Yes.
They're better fed. Now, one of the most important statistics of all is the number of babies who die before the age of 5. For most of human history, something like 50%. 50% of babies dying before the age of 5, often along with their mothers, was the norm. We've left that world. We've left that world. And the change, much of the change occurred in the 20th century. If the length of life is a measure of a good life, life expectancy has doubled globally in the 20th century. The number of people living in extreme poverty has diminished significantly in the last 30 years. So, yes, there are the dangerous stories. I grew up in a world with the atom bomb. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember very vividly expecting to be blown up, living in England within range of Soviet missiles. So there's the bad side and the good side. And this is the great question for the future. Can we collectively organize things so that collaboration wins out over conflict? We now have weapons that mean that if we unleash conflict on the sort of scales of the past, that is a recipe for Armageddon. Can we avoid that? And avoiding it involves global collaboration. And actually, the signs of increasing global collaboration are very powerful. You may be very skeptical or cynical about the United Nations, but the existence of a forum in which every nation on earth can contribute something is a staggering change in human history. Unthinkable 300 years.
Yeah, the fact that you can get the ambassadors to the United Nations, representatives from all the nations around the world into one gathering place where they can have formal discussions and talk about global issues in a reasonable, sophisticated way that's not confrontational, but just, open discussions. What can we do? I agree with you. It's a very positive thing.
And in so many areas, the evidence of collaboration. The media is not interested in feel-good stories because they don't sell.
Yeah.
They don't sell things. But so the media likes blood and conflict. But the evidence of collaboration is actually very powerful. I believe it's true that every member of the United Nations, every nation on Earth, just about, has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. In other words, there is, at least on paper, there is agreement about the sort of future path that looks good as opposed to the future path that looks bad. There is the Paris Accords. Again, you can be very cynical about actual implementation, as I am.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, the fact that every nation on Earth signed up to documents saying that climate change is dangerous, we need to do something about it, is actually remarkable. So if you look for it, the evidence of increasing global collaboration, the evidence that we're beginning to act not as conflicting nations, but as a single species that's looking after our own future and the future of the planet that is our home. The evidence is very powerful. And in fact, at the moment, I'm trying to write a book assembling some of that evidence, and evidence for the idea that what is happening is that a global vision is emerging, shared by most people on Earth, and it's a vision that should support collaboration in building a better future for our children and their children.
What's the title or the working title of the book? Do you have one?
Shared Stories. And the idea behind the book would be that what makes us different, as I said earlier, what makes us different as a species is the fact that what one individual learns can be shared with others, and shared with such precision and on such a scale that information accumulates from generation to generation. I mean, creatures like chimpanzees are very, very smart. Crows are very smart. Whales are very
Yes.
smart.
Yeah.
What their limitation is that they cannot share enough information for that information to accumulate across generations. So we don't see evidence of changing technologies across generations. We see, tiny changes, yes, but not the sort of increasing power over their environments that you see with humans. So it's the sharing of stories that enables, that explains our power as a species. And I like the word stories because it captures some of the ambiguity of knowledge. We never have perfect knowledge. The idea that you can distinguish knowledge into truth and falsehood it doesn't actually work. What we aim for is knowledge or ways of thinking about the world that give us a grip on the world. That's what we aim at. And over time, our ideas that give us a grip on the world have got more and more powerful. That doesn't mean they're true or that the early ideas were false. It's just that they've got more and more powerful. We have a better grip on our environment. So, shared stories. That's the working title at the moment.
Well, I hope you stick with that, because I'll say this: stories and the oral history of humanity is imprinted in our DNA. Before there was, voluminous books on history and science and medicines and things like that. You go into the Mayan culture, they didn't write down their recipes for healing properties from plants in the jungle. It was oral stories told to each other, handed down, Jewish traditions, and everything else. This is how the Dead Sea Scrolls, part of it is story. Some of it's written down, a lot of it's his oral history, but it gets back to the word that you mentioned earlier, which is interconnectedness, because that's how we are, as an elevated species with conscious thought and reasoning, then we are able to be interconnected through our shared stories. But it all goes back because there's interconnectedness. As you say, as you go back and back and back, we have interconnectedness as human beings, interconnectedness as the prior human beings, the DNA of one cell microorganisms, it just goes back and back and back. And it's all interconnected.
But there's a specific type of interconnectedness that makes us different. It's the ability to move complex ideas from my head into your head, which is what this
Yes.
conversation is doing.
Yes.
Chimps can't do that.
Right.
Whales can't do that. Not really complex thoughts. And that particular sort of interconnectedness, I'm trying to write an account of when it first appeared, and you begin to get evidence of shared stories. When you get cave paintings, 50,000 years ago in Sulawesi in Indonesia, people painted figures that looked like half humans, half animals. Now, once you have people painting that, you can be pretty sure these people were telling each other stories. They were creating stories. They were sharing
Mm-hmm.
stories in this way. And I'm also writing a chapter about how people shared stories for most of human history, because writing appears, even the simplest forms of writing, about 6,000 years ago. And you're
Wow.
absolutely right. They they stored huge amounts of shared information in memory.
Right.
They worked at it. And what they used was something that we rarely talk about. They used really complex mnemonic technologies. They worked really hard at embedding memories in associating memories with particular bits of landscape, for example. Stories were important because stories are much more memorable than lists of facts. Exotic stories are much
Yeah.
more memorable than boring stories. So the word story is absolutely appropriate because there was this whole technology of remembering that got lost once writing became common. You and I, we have no clue about that technology. But people in societies without writing were fantastically good at holding a lot of information in their heads in a secure way, much better than we are, and they work really hard at it. And that's why they had what I think we should call science. They had a lot of empirical knowledge that was based on a lot of experience. I mean, for example, how do you eat poisonous cycad nuts are poisonous? You can only eat them if you process them very carefully. So the
Right.
rules of processing them have to be preserved very carefully from generation to generation. You may not understand the chemistry of what's going on, but you do have to preserve the recipes across generations, because if you don't preserve them, someone's going to die because you're going to miss out a crucial part of the process.
Well, I can guarantee thousands of people died trying to figure that out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When you first came out with the big history concept in 1989. One of the early supporters, people of note, an icon in the tech revolution himself, Bill Gates, became a supporter of yours, and he supported you and funded you. What is Bill Gates like? What's it like sitting down and talking with him and sharing your ideas and hearing him spitball with you on his ideas?
Well, look, I should say I'm a huge fan of Bill Gates. By the time he came across big history in about 2007, I'd already been teaching it for 20 years, so the story was fairly clear in my mind. And Well, okay, so here's the story you were asking for. Um,
Oh,
I was
great.
teaching in San Diego at the time, and it's a Monday morning, and I get a phone call, and I'm in a foul mood because I have to do a lot of boring administrative stuff. And so I say, "Yes, yes, what do you want?" And there's a very nice woman's voice the other end says, "Oh, is this a bad time to be phoning?" I say, "No, no, no, what do you want?" And she says, "Well, I'm calling from Mr. Bill Gates' office, because you may not know this, but Mr. Gates is quite a fan of your work." And I said, "Oh, yes." Um, and and she then said, this is a story I have told before, actually, but she then said, "Mr. Gates is coming down to San Diego, and do you think you might be able to find time in your busy schedule to meet Mr. Gates?" And I'm very
Hmm.
proud of the fact that I got the answer right. And the answer, of course, was yes. I can find time in my busy schedule to meet Mr. Gates. And basically, I met him in a hotel room in La Jolla, and he's an enthusiast. And he reads voraciously. He had
Hmm.
just come across this teaching company course that I did on big history, and he loved it. It was just he was incredibly enthusiastic. So I was very, very flattered, of course, but also he was just so fascinated with the ideas that we had a great nerdy conversation for about an hour, at the end of which he said, "Look, I think this is something that all high school students should know about," which is something I'd believed for years. And he said he'd like to support it if I was keen to work with him on doing that. And that's the beginning of what became the Big History Project, which is a free online syllabus in big history, which is now being taught, I'm told, in perhaps 2,000 high schools, mostly in the US, quite a few in Australia.
How does that make you feel? I mean, you talk about complexity and just thresholds. Look at this idea that you came with, and you have somebody like Bill Gates supporting you, and now your idea is being taught in over 2,000 high schools in Australia and the United States. Congratulations. I bet. How's that feel?
But it feels good.
Yeah.
From the moment I started teaching big history, I thought this is a good thing. I thought this is a story that everyone ought to know.
Hmm.
And but I also it breaks the mold of the way knowledge works in our society. So I also faced quite a lot of resistance,
Yeah.
and it made sense that it would be someone who was not part of the academic establishment, but was very well read and very smart, who should it made sense that someone like that might agree with me about the value of big history, whereas I was always going to face a lot, not complete resistance, but I always faced a lot of resistance to it, I think, within the academic establishment for all sorts of very understandable reasons. That
Yes.
the idea of scholarship is based on the idea of specialization of disciplines.
Hmm.
And big history really breaks with that tradition. So of course it's going to face resistance. But I was delighted to have the support of someone who had, pockets deep enough
Right.
to find workarounds. It'll be a long time, I think, before big history does actually become a standard part of teaching. It may never happen, but he certainly made it possible to make a bit of a dent in this process. So I'm immensely grateful to him, and he's still supporting the project 20 years later. We're
That's
working
fantastic.
currently on a revision of the Big History Project.
That's congratulations. That's amazing. What is your vision of the future 100 years from now?
I've actually written a book on the future called Future Stories. Um,
There's that word
and
stories again.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The word stories is becoming more and more central in my thinking about the way knowledge works, the way
Mhm.
human knowledge works. And I don't think anyone who thinks hard about the future will ever offer simple predictions. What they will offer is scenarios. And they may offer sort of likelihoods. I'm an optimist. I actually think bad things will happen in the next 100 years, but I don't think the extreme bad things will happen. Um, we, and I also see lots of evidence of increasing collaboration. I think in 100 years' time, that the global institutions, the institutions that allow humans to collaborate globally on projects such as managing global climates, managing pandemics, um, improving health, eliminating poverty. I think that the mechanisms that allow that will be more powerful than they are today. Um, Now, that's an optimistic view of the future. I think it's a fairly reasonable prediction. Um, it could be that the real future will be not quite as good as that. It'll be much messier than that, and that's
Of
probably a
course it
more
will be.
realistic
Yeah. Yeah.
prediction. It'll be a world in which there are still wars, there's still conflict, there's still poverty, but a world in which we've avoided the worst possible catastrophes. Because ever since the creation of nuclear weapons, we've also been a species that has the power not only to transform the world, but we have the power to destroy much of the biosphere within a few days. Um, and
Mhm.
so an optimistic view of the future is one in which that power is not used. But our other superpowers are used. Our medical skill, our ability perhaps to ease the burden of aging. I predicted, well, I shouldn't say predicted. One of the scenarios I take very seriously for the future is the sending out of colonies to other planets. In the next 100 years, we won't be going to other star systems. That could happen in a few thousand years, but not in the next 100 years. But I think there will be colonies on different parts of the solar system. And the other prediction is that I think, or the other scenario that I think is very, very likely, is that we will start changing our bodies. We'll start modifying our bodies genetically, chemically, using prosthetics of various kinds.
So some
And
ideas of a transhumanism.
yes, yes, the technology is already there. I mean, and
Mhm.
some of it is absolutely wonderful, some of it's really scary. But
Right.
technologies that can allow people who have lost limbs to control artificial limbs by thinking,
Yeah.
that's a transhumanist technology I'm fully in favor of. I have a cochlear implant. I don't know if you know what a cochlear implant is, but
Yes.
I have no hearing at all on my right side. And I have an implant that takes sounds and sends them to transmitters that send pulses to my brain so I can hear. That's transhumanism at work. Uh,
That's
you know,
great.
so So there are some predictions I think we can make, and they depend on A, optimism that we will become more collaborative on global scales, and B, the certainty that technological creativity will continue. And AI, of course, is
You're right.
is the joker in the pack.
Yeah.
Um,
Is there anything that you are curious about that either keeps you up awake, at night, or it just canoodles in your brain all the time?
well, all of these questions about the future. I have grandchildren. I have
Mm.
gorgeous grandchildren. I
Ah,
and I'm pretty sure in 20 years I won't be around. And I will be so annoyed that I'm not going to know where this story goes next. So knowing where those questions about where the story goes next, I think that's one of the reasons why I love this big history story, as inadequate as it is, um, because it is the foundation for thinking about where things are going next, how my grandchildren will be living in 50, 60, 70 years' time. I'd love to be able to know what's going to happen in 100 years' time or 1,000 years' time.
yeah. Well, David, it's been wonderful having you on the Ignition Sequence podcast. Thank you for sharing your ideas about big history. And I predict that you will be part of a rich, big history for many years to come. Thank you and peace, and we'll talk to you again soon someday.
And thank you very much for your questions. It's been a pleasure.
Ignition Sequence is produced by Accelerator Media, a nonprofit organization dedicated to inspiring a lifelong pursuit of knowledge. Join us every week as we dive into the science, the stories, and the extraordinary journeys that challenge our understanding of the world. Subscribe now and ignite your curiosity with us. Ignition Sequence. Listen, learn, repeat.